scientific, and maybe, although there is passion in it too, at least for my part, otherwise I wouldn't be doing this. We are actually starting to create beef in a different way and using medical technology to produce beef. Why do we do that? That's because we identified, and other people have identified with us, a lot of problems with coming up, at least with livestock beef production. And I have a video with two people. One is Richard Wrangham. He's a biological anthropologist from Harvard, who is trying to tell us that we are a species designed to love meat, so that it's sort of ingrained in our anthropology, if you like. And Ken Cook from the Environmental Work Group sort of stresses that we really have upcoming problems with classical beef production. So let's listen to what they have to say. If this is going to start. It's not advancing. Oh, it is. Okay. Can I get the sound?
It's one that is intimately tied to meat. Once we started cooking meat, then we could get lots of energy, and that energy enabled us to have big brains and become physically, anatomically human. Hunters and gatherers all over the world are very sad if, for a few days at a time, the hunters come back empty-handed. The camp becomes quiet, the dancing stops, and then somebody catches some meat. They bring the prey into the camp, or nowadays into somebody's back garden with a barbecue. Everybody gets excited to come and share the meat. It is ritually cut and passed out to people. We are a species designed to love meat.
Feeding the world is a complex problem. I think people don't yet realize what an impact meat consumption has on the planet. 18% of our greenhouse gas emissions come from meat production. We're also using something like 1,500 gallons of water to produce just 1 pound of meat. Meat takes up about 70% of our arable lands. There's no question that if we were able to shift more of our land into intensive fruit and vegetable production, we'd be able to feed a lot more people a lot healthier diet. With the global population growing from 7 billion to 9 billion people, by 2050, the demand for meat will double. We can't just continue doing what we've been doing. Unless we make some changes in how we produce meat on this planet, we're in for a terrible reckoning.
Meat consumption was part of the human species. It's been fantastically beneficial for us. And now, by some horrendous...
He says, now by some horrendous irony, it becomes part of the problem. We have to do something about it. So, what are we going to do about this? We can all become vegetarian. There is really no reason why we would eat meat. There's no medical reason why we would eat meat. Yes, it's an easy access to proteins. Yes, it's an easy access to some of the nutrition that we need, but we can easily substitute it with other stuff. And actually 2 billion people on this planet involuntarily are vegetarian, and they lead happy lives. They are procreative, and there's no problem with it. So we could come up with all sorts of other protein innovations. Now it's going back. Am I pressing the wrong button? Okay. Such as soy and lupin and other legumes. They are protein rich, and you can make all sorts of products of it, as you all know here in this country very well. Recently, mycotic proteins came up, corn in the UK, which is nutritious and is relatively resource efficient being produced. We can start, looking at algae and use that, seaweeds and algae as a protein source and a vitamin source, perfectly healthy for you, and lots of it available. And finally, we can actually turn to insects. Now, in some countries, in some cultures, insects are basically a usual part of the diet. But in the part where I'm coming from, it's actually very difficult to make people eat insects. And so, why is it that beef production, especially beef production, more than pork and chicken, is such an environmental sort of impact. That's because cattle are very inefficient in converting vegetable proteins into animal proteins. Now, this is an interesting statistic, and it's called the human trophic level. And the human trophic level is basically where we are in the food chain. If you are a plant, it's 1. If you are an animal that eats plants, it's 2. If you are an animal that eats animals that eats plants, such as us, it's 3. So if 30% of your diet is animal proteins, then you end up with a ratio of about 2.3. And this is where Europe, this doesn't project, it's the top line, where Europe and the Americas have been for the last sort of decades. And you see in the climbing line here in pink that China and India are gradually creeping up to that same number, meaning that animal proteins from animals that eat plants, that part of the diet is increasing. And why is that? That's because that statistic, that human trophic level, is directly related to the gross domestic product of a country. In other words, if the country becomes wealthier, if middle class incomes rise, as already mentioned this morning, the demand for quality proteins, or at least for meat, actually increases. So this is going to happen. We're going from 7 to 9 billion, or maybe even more. Countries that are still sort of in a developing scale of gross domestic product will become richer, more middle class incomes, meat consumption, meat demand will rise. And it's very questionable whether we can provide that with traditional livestock beef. Now, in 1932, it's 1960, chocolate was being introduced in China. In 1932, Winston Churchill already said in one of his books, at some point we will start to grow the breast of a chicken or the leg of a chicken without producing the entire bird, because it's just a waste of material. And obviously he was a journalist, statesman, but he was a friend of Alexis Carrel, a Nobel Prize winning transplantation surgeon who at that time, for the first time ever, could keep organs alive outside of the body, within the medical sort of field. And they didn't have the technology to really create tissues. That actually came up about 2 decades ago by the use of stem cells. So right now, it's actually possible, I'm doing it again, it's actually possible to create tissues from stem cells for medical purposes, to replace organs, to replace tissues, but also for food. And why is that? It's because we have stem cells in our skeletal muscle. Lots of them, truckloads of stem cells in our skeletal muscle. They're specifically designed or designated to create muscle tissue in case of injury. They're just sitting there doing nothing, but in case of injury, they replace the injury with a piece of skeletal muscle and not with a scar. So that's very helpful. They can proliferate. You can actually culture them. You can culture them outside of the body, and they will, if you provide them the right cues, they will produce muscle fibers, which is the basis of our meat. So that's exactly what we did. So the idea is you take a small sample from a cow. It can be very small, 1 centimeter long and 1 millimeter in diameter. It has a couple of hundred of these stem cells, and they can proliferate at least 50 times. So if you do the math, you can actually get 10,000 kilos of meat from a small sliver of muscle taken from the cow. These cells are designated skeletal muscle stem cells. You cannot make anything else from it. Hardly anything else from it. And so what they need to do in order to become muscle tissue is that they need to merge, because a muscle fiber is a merger of a lot of cells. So this is the merger. It's called a myotube. It's a very primitive muscle fiber that doesn't have a lot of protein yet, doesn't contract, but it is already sort of a primitive muscle fiber. It's the first stage of development. So in order to make that a muscle fiber, we have to pull a little trick in the lab, and that is to provide them with the environment. And this is a funny picture, but this is the funny part, but this is the serious part on the right side. This is a Petri dish with a gel in it, and in the gel we have these muscle fiber cells. And the 2 black stripes are silk wires. They are basically the future tendons of the skeletal muscle. They are glued to the bottom of the dish. Within 24 hours, without us doing anything, just watching, within 24 hours, they have organized into a fiber in between those silk wires. And if you look under the microscope, this already starts to look like a real muscle fiber. So what we have done, we have created a slightly different situation where they grow around a central column so that they grab onto each other. That creates the same sort of attachment. Then they start to contract, they start to build up tension, and they start to build up protein content. And they do that pretty much by themselves because that's what they're programmed to do. So after 3 weeks, it looks like this. It's schematic, of course, but if you now look under the microscope, it's indistinguishable from a muscle fiber that you just take from the first steak from the supermarket. So you harvest them, you create 10,000 of these. It's very tedious work, very labor intensive, so my lab was not very happy with this. But if you do that, you make a lot of these fibers, you assemble them, and even if you add some fat, which we initially did not, then you basically get a hamburger. And that was what we set out to do, to make a proof of concept, to show to the world this can be done. It's maybe not easy, you may have your reservations, but it can be done. And there's actually, driven by the demand, there's a necessity to do so. So we launched this in August in London in 2013, just to convey these messages. It can be done, and it has to be done at some point. So this was a sort of hybrid between a cooking show and a press conference, which for a scientist like me is pretty unusual, I should say. And this is just a small excerpt of it. This was the hamburger served in a petri dish, cooked by a very courageous chef from the south of England. This courageous because this hamburger was €250,000, and it was in front of international TV cameras. And it was eaten by two courageous people, Hanni Ritzler from Austria and Josh Schoenwald from Chicago. They are food critics, they're independent, and they commented on the, they actually volunteered to do this, obviously, and they commented on the taste, that the texture was actually great. The taste was so-so. You know, it was a $250,000 hamburger, so we expected a little bit better. But the taste was so-so. Why is that? Because we really launched it in kind of an early prototype. The fat wasn't still there, so it was kind of dry and tasteless. So that's fine. You have a proof of concept, and what does it require to make a product out of it? We've heard this morning, you know, from Valerie. It's all nice to have wild ideas and to produce this and to make a proof of concept, which is sort of the first step, basically. But what is required to make a product out of it? Well, first of all, it needs to be more efficient than that cow. That was the whole point. So can we make it more efficient than a cow? In other words, can we convert the resources that go into it in a better sort of ratio to animal proteins? Second, it needs to be sustainable. I don't mean that sort of in a general environmental type of way, because that's related to the resources, but in a very specific, strict way. In order to grow cells, you need actually some animal materials that are required and that eventually we won't have. So that we had to work on. And last but not least, we are a species designed to love meat. We are not in this game to make a meat substitute. We are in this game to make meat as you know it, so that it's indistinguishable from the livestock produced thing. That's the goal. Okay, so where are we? We have, obviously in the lab, you have in this culture systems, you have all the conditions under control, you can play with it, you can change the feed, you can change the temperature, you can change the way you grow cells. And in order to make that hamburger, we grew cells in plastic bottles, which is just a traditional way. But now we are culturing them on beads that are swimming in a fluid. And we can actually scale that up eventually to a 25,000 liter bioreactor with which we can feed 40,000 people. So this is just one example of those beads swimming in that solution, and the cells are all the little white dots on the beads. This way we can create a density of cells per milliliter of fluid that's much, much higher than on these flasks. So by changing those conditions and by changing the production system, it not only becomes scalable, but you can also make it more resource efficient. And a very preliminary life cycle analysis shows that this could actually be a reduction of 90% of the land that you need for beef production, 90% of the water, and about 60 to 70% of the energy that you require to produce beef right now. How are we with with the mimicry? I've shown, or I've mentioned to you that the texture is actually fine. The independent tasters, and I agree with them, judge that to be like meat. The taste was so-so, and the color was also so-so. So how are we going to improve on that? Well, first of all, we didn't produce fat tissue. And there are not a lot of medical applications for producing fat tissue, as you can imagine, but there are some in transplantation surgery. And so we needed to really produce fat tissue, and the methodology that is described to produce fat tissue is not compatible with food. You need high doses of steroids and a super caffeine that's actually toxic for people. So we had to reinvent that wheel. This is, on the left side, is fat tissue that we have produced in the lab. All the red stuff is fat. It's getting there. And on the right-hand side, you see what we actually used. These are naturally occurring fatty acids that drive these stem cells to produce fat tissue. Actually, those stem cells to produce fat tissue can be derived from the same biopsy from the cow. So right now we are producing a fair amount of this fat tissue, and we're analyzing it. By the way, these stem cells from cows are technically capable of producing omega-3 fatty acids. They usually don't do that, but they are capable of doing it. So if we can find the right stimulus and tap in this possibility of these cells to do that, we can actually create meat with a fat content and with a fat composition that's healthier for you, that actually lowers your cholesterol instead of increasing your cholesterol. Okay, so the other thing that we experiment with is train these muscles to make from a very lean muscle, sort of a Arnold Schwarzenegger muscle, so that you have lots of protein. You can stimulate them with electrical stimulation. You can stimulate them with chemical stimulation. And eventually you can sort of beef that production up. What we also did is look at the color. The color of beef comes from a protein called myoglobin. It doesn't come from blood. That's a misconception. Chicken blood is just as red as cow blood, but yet the meat is white. So it comes from a protein called myoglobin. And myoglobin is something that is apparently not really present in our cells at sufficient amounts. And it's also the source of iron, of heme iron in our muscle, and probably also affects taste. So we were eager to increase that expression of myoglobin, and just by culturing the cells under low levels of oxygen for a couple of days increases that myoglobin expression for 5-fold. So but it's just an example how you can use these culture conditions to improve the product and have control over it. The final requirement, obviously, is that people need to accept it and eat it. And we have heard a lot about this at this conference, but this is sort of a really radical change. This is a radically new product, although in the end it may look the same, but it comes out of a lab, or out of a factory where we are really used to the idea that it comes from animals and is quote-unquote natural. So this is called in the popular press the Yuck Factor. And it's very interesting to me because the science behind this sort of aversion maybe for this product is not very well developed. Nobody can tell me what the Yuck Factor is. So we have to sort of find out for ourselves what that is. And I have, I'm an amateur. I'm a medical doctor. I'm not a marketeer. I'm not even, I'm just a consumer, not even a food technologist or anything like this. So we had to sort of find out for ourselves. And one of there are two items that I would like to stress here. One is it's new. And everything that's new and unfamiliar may have some sort of question marks in the mind of the consumer, especially if it's a mimic of something that we already know. The interesting part is that we all eat stuff that we don't know the composition of. We are very sort of comfortable with eating materials that we don't exactly know what's in there. So that's because our neighbor has eaten it and our family has eaten it for a long time and they are still alive. So you create sort of a sense of familiarity and comfort with the fact that this is sort of safe. The second is that there is, as has been mentioned at the conference as well, there is a distrust of food manufacturers. The consumer is sort of naturally distrustful of what people do in the food manufacturing. And if food is manufactured by a cow, which is sort of governed by 1.5 million years of evolution, checks and balances in nature, we call that sort of natural, and we think, you cannot mess with it too much. There's just a lot of checks there. Now, if we convert that to a human-made product, and humans make mistakes, they are sometimes fraudulent, all things can happen, so we lose control over how we produce the food, and that's sort of scary. And maybe it's something that we don't want. Now, that's how the technology is being implemented. So we have developed this narrative. This technology is very, very simple. You can do this at home in your kitchen if you like. If you have the incubator, if you have the equipment, we can design it so that you can do it in your home. You have to know about 9 weeks in advance what you want to eat, so it's not very practical, but it can be done. And then you have full control, much more control over how your beef is being produced than you have right now. What is more sort of realistic is an idea from design students in Eindhoven who said, well, suppose you have a neighborhood in, let's say, Shanghai, and you have a little farm with a couple of chicken, a couple of cows, a couple of pigs. You have the children from the schools, attend to them, give them names, feed them, all very romantic, and once in a while you poke them in the butt to get their stem cells, and then in a shed adjacent to the farm, you grow the meat and the chicken and the pork for the entire neighborhood. You can visit the shed if you like on Sundays, and so you have full control over how your food is being produced. So it tells the story that it's the technology on one hand and how it's being implemented on the other hand, and people tend to confuse this, I think. Okay, so that it was not as bad as we thought was sort of shown by a cross-sectional survey in the Netherlands, so it's a very selected sort of country, where we basically asked, after giving a little bit of information, are you in favor of this development? And 63% said yes. In the UK, about the same. And then we also asked, would you buy it in the supermarket if it was available? And then, to our surprise, 52% said yes, or probably yes. So that was a little bit more sort of encouraging than we originally had thought. And it shows that in theory, at least, rationally, people are more adventurous towards these new products. And what has also been shown, and I think the next speakers will also allude to that, if you tell this to people under the age of 30, they don't seem to mind. They seem to accept it right away. If you tell this to kids between the age of 8 and 12, they really become excited. So it is a very age-dependent thing. Okay, so what about the other sort of minor hurdle towards a product development, the fact that this hamburger cost about €250,000? So we have done some work on it. Obviously, it's sort of a model work. It's based on a model system, a production of stem cells for medical purposes by one of the largest producers of medical stem cells. And you start with very small numbers of cells on the left top, and you end with an intermediate number, and finally you end up with that 25,000 liter bioreactor, and you put all the cost factors in it. Then currently, with the current technology, without any improvement, just scaling up production, which we still, by the way, need to show that we can do that, but with just scaling up production in this system, the price would be around $65 per kilo, which is a lot, which is still much more than our current beef price. But we already know what the factors are in this number that can be changed and can be improved to get that price down. That will be a matter of just improving the technology in a matter of time. So I think, you know, this is a technology that is available. There are good reasons to do it because we have really upcoming problems with beef production, both on the environmental side as on the food security side. The technology is there. We need to sort of embrace it. We definitely need to do more research on it to really make it happen. And I think not too far from now, maybe in some 5 to 6 years, we will be able to present beef that, you know, in this picture is sort of mentioned to be cruelty-free, which is a very loaded emotional term, I realize. But I kind of like this slide as a final slide because in my mind, we started this by looking at food security and environmental aspects of beef production. Not really, I personally not started for the animal welfare reasons. I'm a physiologist, you know, I do animal experiments. But I think for the consumer, this could actually be a decisive argument that it is kill-free, ethically superior, cruelty-free, or whatever you want to call it. And I challenge you in thinking, you know, 50 years ahead, where we look back at the times where we still killed animals for our food. If we have an alternative, are we continuing to accept that we are doing that practice? And I think not. I think that will change over time, and our whole concept of what meat is will change over time. Well, I thank you for your attention. I'm happy to entertain questions or comments.
Questions? How would I ask my question in Chinese? You talked about using stem cell technologies to make cultured beef. This reminds me of GMO production of food. So how can you deal with the public disapproval or public disagreement on the use of such technologies? How can we win the support of the public? Now, if you look at the GMO food, many people are concerned about the possible negative impact on human health. As an expert, I would like you must know much about the GMO food. I would like to ask you about your opinion on the possible negative impact on human health for stem cell-based products or GMO products.
That's interesting because when we launched that Hamburger in London, I got like 9 interviews, and the last one was from CCTV. And the first question they asked me is, you know, what do you think about GMO food? And the second question I said, well, this is not GMO. It's not genetically modified. It's just cultured cells. We don't really mess with the genes of these cells. And the second question she asked me is, how do you think about genetically modified food? To be honest, this is not only a Chinese thing. If in that survey, we actually really addressed that question. If this would be genetically modified, how would you think about it then? And that's an absolute no-go. You know, it would be immediately rejected. So I'm very, very cautious into not addressing the GMO issue. Personally, for me, the problem with GMO is not so much human health. It's the maybe lack of control that we have over cross-fertilization and the development of invasive species in nature. And I think a lot of research has to be done on that to address that particular question. That particular problem you don't have with this technology because even if it gets out of the lab, it's dead and it will never really cross-fertilize with anything else. So that particular problem we don't have. So if you are still concerned, which I'm really not, about the health effects of aberrant genes in a particular organism that you eat, then yes, that we cannot address other than that we don't genetically modify these cells. But in terms of the environmental impact, this one cannot have that.
OK， 那个我想问一个。
A question. If we do cultured beef for the same batch, I would like to say that every beef product is from the same batch of genes, have the same genes. So when we choose what genes to culture, it will lead to beef of different taste and texture, right?
That's a good question. So first of all, that could be a positive thing, right? The fact that beef can be produced at a sort of very stable quality sounds kind of boring, but it could be a positive thing for consumers. In my mind, consumers like consistency. They like predictability, even of natural products. That's why you see all these, all these beautiful apples that are exactly the same and not in different size and not, in different colors, but they're all exactly the same. That's why we produce in the Netherlands factory-made cheese, because it's every day it's the same. Whereas, I grew up with farm-made cheese, which was different depending on the season, and we loved it. But it's so it could be a positive thing. Second is what I've shown here is making a hamburger. Why did we do that? Because this technology is suitable for making small pieces of meat and not for an entire steak. For an entire steak, you would have to use a different sort of principle. It's not completely different, but you have to create blood vessels or a channel system to keep the whole tissue alive during culture. That's why I, at some point, had a printer in the slide, because in order to make a steak, you would need to sort of either 3D print the blood vessels and the cells at the same time, and then you can design pretty much any tissue that you want, with marbling, without fat, with lots of blood vessels, with very little blood vessels, hexagonal, cubic, spherical, whatever you like, in any color, so you can let your fantasy go.
Post 教授你好。
My question is, in your presentation, you said that the cost of cultured beef can be as high as over $60 a kilo. We know that traditionally produced beef has one cost that is neglected, which is carbon footprint it has. So because of that, the gap between cultured and natural beef is not very big. We can improve the technology so that we could reduce the cost of cultured beef so that it can be commercialized as soon as possible. So my question is, are there any clear ways to reduce the cost of cultured beef? Do we have any directions?
Yeah, so in that model, if I'm just going by that model, one of the indicators is the amount of cells that you can culture per milliliter of food. So in this model, we assumed that was 5 million cells per milliliter of fluid. What has already been published is that you can go up to 20 million. Then that cost comes down fourfold. I asked a question about waste streams. This is a contained sort of culture environment. You can recycle the waste and use that again. So there are ways of improving the production process that can even reduce that cost further. But you're right about the CO2 tax or CO2 sort of cost. And I'm convinced that at some point governments will figure out that livestock is contributing to greenhouse gas emission and that we should put a CO2 tax on it.
So you said you are also working on medical tissues, and you see maybe that in someday in vitro meat may have a medical use. Like you said, 3D steaks that you also can print 3D body parts.
I'm in a medical school, so yes, that's and especially that's why I'm actually eager to start developing those thicker tissues together with blood vessels. That's actually my specialty, to make blood vessels. Yeah. That's what I've been doing for 25 years. And so I'm very eager to start doing that, because that would also enter into the medical applications of these tissues. Yes, definitely.
Thank you.
For that, obviously, we need to use human cells.
Yeah.
And for the moment, I'm not going to make human beef.
Yeah. Thank you.